They say the sea does not forgive weakness. They also say that a woman on a ship spells trouble. Well, I was that trouble for 40 years. I cut my hair so I would smell of salt instead of perfume, and I taught English lords to pray not to God, but to my flag. My name is Grace O'Malley, and today I will tell you how to cheat death, the queen, and fate itself. Welcome to the channel Fateful Women of the Ages. Here we examine and discuss the fates of women whose willpower and determination had an indelible, truly fateful impact on history. The west coast of Ireland, 16th century. The wild cliffs of Connaught. Here, the law is the sea and God is whoever has the fastest sails. Grace was born into the family of the O'Malley clan chief, whose motto was, "Strong on land and sea." But there was one problem. Grace was a girl. By the age of 10, Grace knew the workings of a galley better than embroidery. She spent whole days at the pier, breathing in the smell of tar and dried fish. But in 16th century Ireland, despite the relative freedom of women, the sea was considered a man's domain. One day, her father, Owen Black Oak O'Malley, was preparing for a long voyage to the shores of Spain. "Father, take me with you," Grace begged, standing on the deck. Owen just shook his head sadly. "The sea is no place for a girl, Grania. Your long hair will get tangled in the ropes, and your skirts will prevent you from running along the rigging. Stay home and learn to be a lady." Grace silently went to her room, took a pair of heavy tailor's scissors, and with one decisive movement cut off her luxurious chestnut locks. When she came out onto the shore, her head was almost completely shaved, and she was wearing a simple men's shirt. "Now they won't get confused," she said, looking her father straight in the eye. That is how she got her nickname, Grain M. Hale, Grain the Bald. Owen laughed when he saw his own stubbornness reflected in his daughter and allowed her to board the ship. Her first voyage became a school of life for her. She learned to read the stars like an open book, to feel the change in the wind on her skin, and to understand the language of the currents. Grace was not afraid of storms or hard work. She climbed the rigging alongside seasoned sailors, and soon the men of the O'Malley clan stopped seeing her as the chief's daughter. Legend has it that during one of the first clashes with an English privateer, when the sailors began to waver under a hail of arrows, Grace climbed the mast and began singing an old Irish song, mocking the enemy. Her fearlessness restored the warriors' courage, and the enemy ship was boarded. That day, she washed her blade in salt water and blood for the first time, realizing a simple truth. At sea, it is not titles that are respected, but courage.
At 16, Grace was married off to Donal O'Flaherty. Donal was hot-tempered and ambitious, and he owned Castlecirk, a castle on an island in the middle of Loch Corrib. But the family idyll did not last long. In one of the skirmishes over land, Donal was killed by members of the rival Joyce clan.
The Joyces rejoiced. They were certain that Castle Kirk, which they called Rooster Castle in honor of Donal's quarrelsome nature, would now fall into their hands like an overripe apple. "What will a woman do?" they laughed. "She'll hand over the keys and go mourn her husband." But when Joyce's armada of boats approached the walls, they were met not with cries, but with whistling crossbow bolts. Grace personally stood on the battlements. It is said that she ordered the lead to be removed from the castle roof and melted down. When the enemies tried to set up ladders, boiling metal rained down on their heads. Grace was everywhere. She encouraged the defenders, bandaged wounds, and took up the sword herself. The siege lasted several days. Seeing that the castle would not surrender, and that the widow fought fiercer than any warrior, the Joyces retreated in horror and superstitious reverence.
After this victory, the castle was renamed. People said that if Donal was the rooster, then Grace was the hen protecting her nest. Since then, Castle Kirk has been called Hen's Castle. She not only regained her right to her husband's castle, but she also proved to all of Ireland that her power did not depend on the men standing beside her.
After her father's death and her return to her homeland, Grace took command of the entire O'Malley clan fleet. Her armada consisted of maneuverable Irish galleys, strong oak ships with low sides that could be propelled by both sail and oars. These ships were designed for Ireland's rugged coastline. Where heavy English galleons ran aground, Grace's galleys slipped between the rocks like shadows. She created a unique warning system. Lookouts kept watch around the clock on the cliffs of Clare Island and Achill Head. As soon as the sail of a merchant ship, Spanish, French, or English, appeared on the horizon, a column of smoke rose into the sky.
Grace called her activities fair taxation. Any ship entering Clyde Bay or passing its shores had to pay for safe passage. The sea belongs to God, and the shores belong to O'Malley, she said.
If the captain refused to pay, Grace's galleys would suddenly emerge from the fog. Her men, armed with axes and long knives, would board the ship in a matter of minutes. Grace was always the first on the enemy's bridge. She didn't take everything, she took the sea's share. Wine, fabrics, iron, and gold, leaving the sailors alive and with enough provisions to reach port and tell everyone who the true queen was. At that time, no ship dared to cross the Atlantic near Connaught without carrying a ransom for Grace. Her fleet became a state within a state, and her treasury was fuller than that of many Irish lords. Grace then realized that to expand her influence, she needed Rockfleet Castle, a powerful maritime stronghold on the shore of the bay. The castle belonged to Richard Burke, nicknamed Iron Richard, Risteard and Iron. Grace proposed marriage to him, but with an unusual condition. The union would last exactly 1 year, and after that time, either party could dissolve it by simply saying 3 words. According to Irish Bregan law, such trial marriages were legal. Richard, charmed by Grace's power and wealth, agreed. Grace immediately moved her fleet and people to Rockfleet, fortifying its walls and turning it into her main base. She had fought side by side with Richard all year, but when the term came to an end, she waited for her husband to return from another outing. Grace locked the massive gates of Rockfleet in front of him, and standing on the crenellated wall, shouted loudly, "Richard Burke, I dismiss you." Richard was stunned, but by law he no longer had any rights to his wife or the castle, which was now completely under Grace's control. Despite such a bold breakup, they remained allies until the end of Richard's life, and Grace bore him a son, who was born right in the midst of a naval battle. Grace was married to Richard Burke when the sea called her back. Despite being late in her pregnancy, she set sail on her flagship galley. She went into labor right in the middle of the voyage, in a cramped cabin, with the sound of the waves in the background. Less than an hour after the baby was born, a watchman's cry rang out across the bay. The sails of Algerian corsairs appeared on the horizon, determined to take advantage of the Irishmen's weakness. Pirate ships surrounded the Grace galley, and a fierce boarding battle began. Seeing that their leader was lying in her cabin, the Irish sailors began to lose heart under the onslaught of the superior enemy forces. Hearing the clang of steel and the cries of despair from her people, Grace could not remain on the sidelines. She rose from her bed, pale but with fire in her eyes, wrapped her bloodied body in sheets, and armed with 2 muskets went out on deck. "Is it easier for you to give birth than to fight?" Her voice thundered across the deck. She fired both muskets, killing the leaders of the attackers, and threw herself into the thick of the battle. The sight of their mistress, who had risen from the dead to defend the ship and her son, filled the Irish with mad courage. The pirates, believing that they were facing the wrath of the sea goddess herself, threw themselves overboard in terror. The battle was won. Grace returned to her son's cabin only after she was sure that the last enemy had been defeated and the deck of her ship had been cleared. Grace O'Malley was no longer just a pirate, but a legend whose name made English governors pale. But clouds were gathering. Elizabeth I, Queen of England, decided to take control of the rebellious island. Her son and brother were captured and thrown into prison. Realizing that military force would not help here, Grace decided on a desperate step, to go to the very heart of the enemy, to London, to Queen Elizabeth I. When the old Irish woman, whose face was weathered by sea salt and wrinkles, entered the luxurious halls of Greenwich Palace, the courtiers held their breath. Grace was dressed in a simple Irish dress, her head crowned with a shock of gray hair. She refused to kneel, looking Elizabeth straight in the eye. "I am not a subject of your crown," she said through an interpreter. "I am the free ruler of my people. We are 2 queens, each in our own domain." They spoke in Latin, the only language they both understood without intermediaries. Grace proposed a deal. "Free my family, and I will defend your shores from enemies, not out of loyalty to you, but out of loyalty to my land." Elizabeth, accustomed to flatterers, was struck by the woman's directness and grandeur. Elizabeth saw Grace not as a criminal, but as a kindred spirit, a woman who had fought her entire life for power in a man's world. The outcome of the meeting was unimaginable. Elizabeth ordered the hostages to be released and allowed Grace to continue her activities in Irish waters. The 2 great women formed an unspoken alliance based on mutual respect for an unbreakable strength. Ireland was suffocating under the yoke of English governors, but the waters of Clew Bay still obeyed only one woman. Grace O'Malley was 73 years old, an age that for many meant retirement by the fireside, but not for her. Her hair had turned white as sea foam, and her hands were dry and gnarled like the roots of an old oak tree, but her grip on the hilt of her sword remained iron. On that clear afternoon, her small galley collided with an English warship prowling off the coast of Mayo. The English captain, a young and arrogant officer, saw an old woman in rags on the enemy's deck, laughed, and ordered his men to board, hoping for easy glory. He did not know that this old woman had seen the fall of kings and the birth of empires. When the ships came alongside each other, Grace was the first to step onto the enemy deck. Her cry, hoarse and furious, froze the English soldiers in their tracks. She fought not just as a warrior, she fought like the Atlantic itself. Each of her attacks was precise, each movement honed by years of naval combat. Seeing their mistress in front, O'Malley's gallows speakers charged into the English ranks with frenzied force. In the heat of battle, the English captain tried to strike her down, but Grace deftly dodged and counterattacked, knocking the weapon from his hands. "Look at me, boy," she whispered in Latin, pressing the blade to his throat. "The sea knows no old age, it knows only strength." The Englishmen, demoralized by the fury of the gray-haired pirate, surrendered. Grace did not kill the captain. She ordered him to be put ashore so that he would remember whose waters these were for the rest of his life. It was her last major battle. Shortly after that, she left, leaving behind a legend that neither centuries nor laws could erase. What do you think about the story of this strong woman? What inner strength does a woman need to stand up for herself among cruel and domineering men? Leave your opinion in the comments and subscribe to participate in reviews and discussions of future stories.